Thank you for joining today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some important information. The audience is muted. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat button. That is where we will drop in speakers' bios and links to information that we are talking about today. We are recording this briefing, and we will share a link to it in a follow-up email. Closed captioning has been enabled for this briefing. To view, please click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. In today's panel, we will talk about the next chapter in our Sounds Like Hate podcast. Sounds Like Hate is available now at soundslikehate.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. You will find that link in the chat. We will explore today how one Vermont high school, Randolph Union High School, is grappling with whether to fly the Black Lives Matter flag and whether to remove a mascot some say bears a disturbing resemblance to a hooded Ku Klux Klansman charging on a horse. We will also discuss how the movement for racial justice has made its way into schools across the country. I would now like to introduce our speakers in order of discussion. Jamila Paksima. Jamila is an executive producer, journalist, director, and filmmaker. She produces award-winning documentaries, political and investigative reports about pressing social and civil rights issues. Her work has been featured on PBS, MSNBC, BBC, Independent Lens, and Amazon. Also joining us is T. Elijah Hawks. Elijah is the principal at Randolph Union School that is the focus of our newest podcast chapter called Not Okay. He has been a public school teacher and a principal for more than 2 decades in rural and urban school communities, including Randolph Union High School in central Vermont and the James Baldwin School in New York City, where he was the founding principal. He is an advisor to Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab, PERIL, at American University. His writings about adolescence, public schools, and democracy have appeared in various publications, including Rethinking Schools, Teaching Tolerance in Schools, Schools, Studies, and Education. He is the author of the book, School for the Age of Upheaval, Classrooms That Get Personal, Get Political, and Get to Work. Also joining us is Cory Collins. Cory is the senior writer for Teaching Tolerance, the education project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. He is a former sports journalist who has also worked in schools. Cory's work has frequently focused on understanding the intersection of sports and social justice, interrupting racist practices in schools, supporting LGBTQ youth, promoting digital literacy, and protecting young people from radicalization. I'd like to start this discussion by playing a clip from Sounds Like Hate, which had exclusive interviews with students and faculty at Randolph Union. Before we play that clip, I do want to remind audiences that are listening right now that what you may hear is disturbing and it may be triggering. So for those who would like to turn down their volume while we play this clip, please know that when the clip is concluded, I will signal that you can return your volume up to normal sounds by pulling on my right ear. Let's move to the clip.
Listen to the new podcast series, Sounds Like Hate.
I've been physically assaulted and was repeatedly called the N-word and that I was gonna get shot.
I see my students with Nazi symbols on their hands. I'm hearing an uptick in the N-word. I just was like, what is happening?
We take you inside a high school caught in the crosshairs of racism and a battle ripping their community apart.
I potentially have a fire here that can devolve into violence.
Will students at Randolph Union High School in Vermont raise a Black Lives Matter flag?
When I see that flag and I read it, it tells me my life don't matter because I'm not black.
I see all of your black power, but where's white power?
And will the school change their beloved mascot, a galloping ghost resembling a KKK knight? What was one of the first racist symbols that you saw in this school?
The mascot was probably the first. It just shows that people kind of turn a blind eye to racism.
Independent journalism. Subscribe and listen to Sounds Like Hate, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you get your favorite podcasts.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to turn to Jamila right now. Jamila, hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Eric, how are you? Thank you so much.
It's wonderful and to see you, and thank you for being with us today. Talk to us a little bit about what led you to Randolph Union.
Well, we have been looking at starting this podcast and wanted to find out what was happening with young people getting radicalized. And through some of our research, we met Cynthia Idris Miller at American University with a Peril Project. And she had been contacted by Elijah Hawks, the principal of Randolph Union High School, because he has had some concerns that he may have some young people who are on the path of radicalization. And it was that introduction that opened the door for us into doing this story. And once we spoke with Elijah and he welcomed our production team to come and see the work that they were doing, they were going to start a advisory lesson on hate symbols, specifically the OK sign, the upside down OK sign, which has now become a hate symbol used by white supremacist groups. And that was sort of our entree. And then we realized there was so much more happening at Randolph Union High School.
And tell us a little bit about yourself and how you responded as you began to learn more about what was happening at Randolph.
Well, I mean, I was surprised by some things that we experienced and saw there in the conversations we were having with students and with teachers. Clearly, there was an issue going on with a rise in hateful language, hateful symbols, threats to students. And in the year prior to us getting there, there were some students who had started an initiative to raise the Black Lives Matter flag at their school. This created tremendous division in the community. I know that Elijah was trying to work with his students, and there's a special class that was started, a racial justice class that also worked alongside some of the students trying to raise the Black Lives Matter flag. And in their community forums, the first one was pretty divisive. A lot of people complained, and then it got very divided. And I don't want to give away everything that happens in the podcast, but clearly there was division in the community. And then we also came to learn that Randolph Union has a long-standing mascot, as you saw in the trailer. And we were trying to the school was trying to figure out what's the appropriate time to address this. And that was a big issue, because how many issues could this small community handle?
And why do you think it had become a flashpoint in the community?
Well, just quickly for a backdrop, Randolph and the community around there is 95% white. The students in the school are 95% white, and the minority students really have a lot to do with trying to, educate other students about their experiences. And I think that just not having a large minority community has been an issue. I also think that the flashpoint, I think, became with, are they doing too much? Why can't they just leave what was fine historically alone? And that was a big issue in the community. And I think what Randolph Union was facing was, you have some students who are ready for change, but you also had community members who seemed pretty dug in and did not want to change. And then there were allies that started to come around, young people, some of their families. And so how to balance this with all these issues. And incredibly, we were there starting our reporting in February, and then the pandemic happens. And now here we are in this racial reckoning, and young people are going to be facing these same questions in their schools this year. I mean, we have seen so many protests around the country filled with young people, and we have to face the fact that our educators are going to have to answer these questions that these young people have around Black Lives Matter.
This seems like a good time to turn to Elijah, who is the principal of Randolph Union. Elijah, talk to us. I want to thank you first for joining us today, but tell us a little bit about yourself and Randolph Union High School and how these issues began, and help us catch up to where things are now.
Thanks, Eric. It's really nice to be on the panel with Jamila and Cory and with you. Briefly about me, I'm a Vermonter. I grew up in Vermont, just about half an hour away from Randolph, where I teach. I went to public school here, went away when I went to college, and then found myself in New York City, as you mentioned in the beginning, where I started my work as an educator, and came back to Vermont about 10 years ago and have been at Randolph Union since then. Randolph is a 7 through 12 school. Sometimes our middle and high schools in Vermont are grades 7 through 12, about 400 students. And we serve primarily 3 towns, Randolph, Brookfield, and Braintree, and then a small portfolio of other choice towns who can send students to us either because they don't have a high school or for other reasons. And let's see, when I think about how these issues began, of course, when it's like you can't go far enough back in time, right? If you're talking about reckoning with racism in our country, and the issues that we're wrestling with are our nation's issues now for 500 years. But much more recently than that, some of the things that come to mind for me are our assemblies. I could talk about a couple of our assemblies, which I think are significant because it's when the whole 7 through 12 community comes together several times a year. And I think back to the spring of 2017, just before our final whole school assembly in June, I was primarily working with the younger grades at the time. My co-principal and I received a letter from a graduating senior who said to us that she was glad to be leaving and she was worried about her younger sister. And these were girls who identify as students of color, people of color. And she had a list of incidents and omissions and mistakes and lost opportunities, wounds that she endured over her time at the school and felt had not been adequately addressed. And that was a significant moment for me to hear that student's voice. I asked her if I could refer to her letter at the whole school assembly the next day and if I could share it with faculty. And she said yes to that. And so at the assembly, we made a commitment to better value and understand the voices of the diverse students in the diverse student body in our school. So we started the next school year actually by asking faculty at our opening whole school assembly, faculty who can claim an identity that is often derided in the mainstream culture, to speak to the strength of that identity to the whole school at the beginning of the school year. So we had a teacher who identifies as having being of Middle Eastern descent, claim that identity and talk about how she feels if she hears such identities put down or derided. And a teacher who is an immigrant spoke, a teacher who has a physical disability spoke, a teacher who identifies as being part of the LGBT community spoke, and all of them were claiming those identities as positions of strength and meaning in their lives. And they expressed a hope for the school, and they talked about how they feel when they hear those identities picked on. We actually ended that school year with a similar assembly, but that time invited students to do the same. And a girl spoke of having Abenaki heritage, and another girl spoke about being part of the LGBT community. And each of them expressed a hope for the school for the next year. And one of the students who Jamila and Geraldine interview in the podcast spoke at that assembly as well, Zai. and he identified as being of mixed race. And he expressed a hope for the school that we would fly the Black Lives Matter flag the following year. And well, he said, I asked that the faculty and staff start the school year with the Black Lives Matter flag flying. We didn't do that to start the school year, and I'd be happy to talk later about why we didn't, and why I didn't say yes earlier to a few requests to do that. But that summer, before that summer after that assembly, when Zai made that request, a group of faculty were meeting, continuing some meetings that had happened over the last school year, ad hoc voluntary committee meetings to discuss race and racism in our own lives and in our school. And also over the summer, Curtis Reed reached out to me. He's a Vermonter who works for the Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. And he sent me an email and he said, could I come visit and look at your mascot and talk to you about your mascot? And I said yes, and he visited the school, and we walked the halls, and he showed me side by side a picture of our mascot next to an image from one of the most widely viewed films in the early history of cinema, Birth of a Nation, where there's a hooded rider and a hooded horse. And he put those images side by side for me that summer, and left me with that. And I decided that I was going to continue that conversation with the school that school year. So at the first opening assembly of that school year, I presented those images side by side to start that conversation more broadly in our school. Not that it hadn't been happening in much smaller pockets, but that was a way to make it a broader public conversation.
And Elijah, let me ask a question really quick, because it is interesting. I mean, you took the leadership to lift the question and the conversation up to a school-wide level, which is unique. Often, we know the majority of Americans certainly support race equity in schools. Educators are often faced with a crisis, and while wanting to do something, they usually freeze. But you leaned in this moment. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you felt it was important to lean in and to elevate. And it wasn't just learnings. If I understand correctly, teachers then also formed an elective class on racial justice?
Yes, that class opened that same fall. So I think if we do enough listening to our neighbors and to our children and to ourselves and to the honest voices telling the hard truths about our history, we'll feel accountable to those truths and to those children. And so I feel accountable to that conversation I had with Curtis Reed, my Vermont neighbor. I feel accountable to that girl who wrote us that letter, and to her younger sister. So that kind of accountability that comes through close relationships and listening is a motivator for all of us, I think, and motivator for me. But just briefly to discuss how the momentum built that fall for some of this, for some of these discussions. Yes, we started the Racial Justice Alliance as a high school elective in our, what we call our PBL lab, our project-based learning lab, which we staff with a director of applied learning. And the goal of those courses is to engage students in collaboration with each other and with the broader community to confront contemporary challenges. And so we've had PBL classes focused on climate change and economic inequality and other things less controversial, like artistic production and youth radio, that sort of thing. But this was a Racial Justice Alliance, and students were drawn to it and they enrolled. And that group started to take on the work of educating people around the school to the importance of the Black Lives Matter symbol in our country now, and given our history. And our students were inspired by students in Montpelier, Vermont, who were the first school to raise that flag in our state the spring prior. But as that work is getting underway, as I've started the school year with that assembly, inspired by my conversation with Curtis, events start happening that are very public and full of menace, including an incident at a soccer game where one of our students of color, actually a group of our students, were leaving the parking lot or heading into the school, and they were confronted by a student from the visiting team, and that student called the students of color the N-word. And then his mother got out of the truck and addressed the students with the same language. And that was a fraught, very tense and full of menace moment, actually, in the parking lot, with a big truck humming, getting ready to leave the school. Very public, and it became a great concern for our community. There was also very visible graffiti in our bathrooms, again, full of menace. And it was erased, and then it reappeared. So again, like hyper visible incidents of hate speech were starting to trouble the school at the same time that we were having school-wide conversations through the work of the Racial Justice Alliance in our advisory and in our faculty meetings about the importance of the Black Lives Matter symbol and what it can mean for a school to raise it.
Thank you for that, Elijah. And Colin, I want to turn to you, and I want to talk a little bit about the current state of education, Black Lives Matters in schools nationwide, and talk to us a little bit about what you and your team have heard over the last few months, and what does it tell us about the movement for Black Lives and its increase in communities nationwide as a conversation, and how that's reflected back in education?
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jamila and Elijah, for sharing these stories. I think it's really important. There are a lot of lessons we can take away in schools and outside of them. Obviously, as this movement for Black Lives is going on nationwide, a lot of what we're seeing being in the education space is a demand and a need for a reckoning with the history of racism and how racism and white privilege and these other isms show up in systems, including school systems. And of course, it goes without saying that educators and students are tied up in this in a very personal way as well, of course. Black educators are reckoning with this injustice as they also face an incredibly difficult school year. And Black students are speaking up right now about the ways in which they are over-policed in their communities and in their schools, and the ways in which the curriculum also polices them and erases them and silences them. So at the same time that, many of these educators and students are part of this movement for Black Lives, we're also hearing about how other students are very vulnerable to misinformation campaigns and white nationalist recruitment. And you're well aware of that, Eric, as somebody with Western State Center. You all are right on top of this work. So I think ultimately we're hearing that the diversity of this movement, that coalition building, the endurance of this movement, the nationwide impact of this movement has made this impossible to ignore. So even the most staunch believers in separating schools from social issues are seeing that they have to address this moment, and they have to look inward on themselves and inward on their schools. And I think one of the ways this is manifesting, one of the reasons that those school leaders are being forced to listen, is because nationwide there are student-led movements, as Jamila was referring to, that are not just demanding, police reform in their communities, but also demanding better curriculum, better Black history education. They're demanding an end to school resource officers who over-police their peers. And we've seen this from Baltimore to Honolulu. We've seen this from in-person protests to digital campaigns that are exposing racist incidents at private schools. I'm thinking of demonstrations that range from a 5th grade girl in the Bronx who led her own march with just her friends. And then there's, a march in Nashville that 6 teens organized, 6 teenagers that, drew more than 10,000 people. So in all of these cities across the country where these movements are happening, there are also students simultaneously asking their school leaders and their district leaders to improve their curriculum, to make sure that they feel represented at school, and to also make sure they feel included and valued and safe in those communities. And I think that as civil rights movements have always been, young people are leading the way, and they're also, they're demanding liberation within education, not just outside of it.
That's very helpful. And how are you seeing this playing out in schools?
I would say it's mixed. You know, on the positive side, we're seeing many schools responding with promises to reckon with this racism. We're seeing more schools instituting anti-racist professional development for their staff. You know, just with the resources we offer, we saw a huge influx of people looking for answers, looking for, you know, ways to integrate social justice into schools and to institute more Black history curriculum. But on the negative side, you know, to be honest, we are seeing educators that are facing some pushback for expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter or other human rights causes. You know, there was an educator in Texas who was put on leave after caregivers complained about her having a Black Lives Matter poster in her virtual classroom. In LA, there was a teacher who wore "I Can't Breathe" on her t-shirt, and, you know, she was facing death threats. I think there was one here in Massachusetts where I live, an educator who talked to her kids about the fact that racism can exist systemically within a police force, and she was put on leave. So we're certainly seeing some courageous school leaders who are responding to this movement in this moment with action and attempts at reconciliation, because a lot of harm has been done in our schools. I think we're also seeing others who are retreating behind a guise of neutrality, or they're saying students' identities don't matter to them, you know, that all are treated the same, even when evidence says otherwise. And, you know, we're also seeing a lot of people who are afraid of that community pushback, that they'll be charged with indoctrinating students, or that this is too political. And that, you know, hiding behind those things is ultimately a choice that harms all students, and denies them a complete and equitable education. But we, at Teaching Tolerance, we are heartened by the fact that educators all across the country are continuing to support student activists and push for more inclusive, liberatory school spaces. And we're seeing more of that than ever before, and that's a hopeful note.
That is interesting. And Colin, thank you for sharing that. And I want to stay on this piece for a second around students and schools, staff responding. So I want to come back to Elijah for a second. Elijah, we have school systems that are responding, as Colin just talked about, and the movement for racial justice is growing. School has just started at Randolph Union. Share with us a little bit about how that is unfolding in the early days.
Yeah, we are back to school in Randolph, as most schools in Vermont are, in person, and some students are remote. On the surface, it's really quite quiet, actually. Part of that has to do with being in a hybrid mode, so half the students are in school on some days and the other half on other days. So it feels actually quite different than a normal high school. But beneath the surface, and or just, you know, latent and waiting to come out, of course, are all of the strong feelings of adolescence, and of course, feelings and emotions, insecurities, and strong stances associated with the political moment that we're in. We're also, you know, we're in students' homes sometimes, in the screens with them, and we see them coming into school with t-shirts and hats, and they're declaring their allegiances with these symbols, posters, hats. They are engaged in the political discourse. They are repeating things that they hear at home and in the media. They are, some of them, pushing back on things that they hear at home and in the media. And it's an ideologically, I think, very active time. And there's appropriately acute sensitivities to racism. I think we have some young people at the school who are becoming very vocal allies. We had of students of color. We had a student share with us very recently, just last Thursday, I think, that there had been a social media post, a kind of podcast that some students had been producing over the summer that contained a joke that was full of misogyny and racism and violence. And it was something that was disturbing to him, and it was shared with us. And I've spent probably 5 or 6 hours over the past few days in conversations with the students who were involved, in conversations with their families, and with teachers, administrators, even a bit with our legal team, because we're in that zone where things that are said and done outside of school can impact what happens inside of school. And so we've spent some time in conversation with these young people about how the nexus of school life extends outside of school when you start intersecting with protected categories, potential harassment and bullying concerns. So those conversations aren't loud in public right now, but they're present. And our Racial Justice Alliance is just getting started again this year. They're listening to the podcast, Jamila, this week, and they will be next week, episode 2, which none of us on this side of things have heard yet. And then they'll be helping our school create some containers for dialogue for the broader community. The teachers and students there are looking for that leadership opportunity. I actually had a letter to the editor of the local paper ready to go this week to make sure that people were aware of the podcast and encourage them to listen closely to the stories. But the Racial Justice Alliance class said, no, we're writing a letter next week to the editor. And so far I've just told the community to look out for that and to look out for opportunities for further dialogue that'll be led in part by our students in that alliance.
And let me ask this a different question, a different way. What lessons have you learned from having to engage a community that feels divided? Some individuals on the attack aggressively towards your stand for race equity, others who have stood up to forge support and alliance for you. What lessons might you share with us?
I wrote a piece for Teaching Tolerance actually called Heavy Topics, Strong Classrooms. And the lessons there that I'm trying to share with teachers are lessons I've learned as a leader. And one of them is that we need to do work early on in a school year and indeed throughout the year that values every family and every child that walks into our building. We need to establish trust with people and find things about them that are valuable and important and reflect that back to them. And so I believe that no matter what a person's political beliefs may be, there's something in their life or experience with which I can empathize. And so I work to find those connections with people, even if we have huge disagreements about what's ethical or what's appropriate for school. So I spend a lot of time in conversation. If people will come in and talk with me or speak with me on the phone, a lot of conversations with parents and community members along those lines. And so I try to establish with them that I value who they are as human beings and that I want to listen to them and understand their stories. One of the family members in the podcast, I think he probably agreed to participate in the podcast, Jamila, because I'd spent hours and hours and hours in conversation with him about the Confederate flag and the Black Lives Matter flag, and understanding some of his experience as a military veteran who'd done several tours of duty in Afghanistan, and understanding what it means for him to help raise his grandchild and to have another grandchild that's a biracial child. So it's about strong human connection, and within that space of relationship, being able to have conversations about what's right and what's right and what's wrong.
Elijah, one more question, and then I have a question for our entire panel. But if you had to give 1 or 2 pieces of advice to many of the educators and who are listening right now to this podcast, what are 2 pieces of advice you might share with them?
I would say that, I think 3 things come to mind. I think that the containers for dialogue need to be everywhere, and that our educators need to be skilled and thoughtful facilitators of discussion. It's really nothing super sophisticated. There needs to be a commitment to discussion norms. There need to be facilitation skills. There need to be protocols that value every voice in the room. There need to be circles happening everywhere where people are very carefully listening and not talking over each other. Very simple, timeless, actually, ways for people to listen to each other and self-reflect. They need to be happening all over the school, including, very importantly, in faculty meetings. We have to make space among ourselves as adults to do that kind of work of self-reflection and listening to each other and talking about things that are difficult to talk about. So that's one thing, is that those containers for dialogue need to be everywhere throughout the school. And the other thing that I think needs to pour into those containers for dialogue are personal stories and historical facts. We need both of those things when we're tackling social change and when we're challenging the status quo and we're trying to understand our world. We need to listen to each other, our neighbors, our children, and ourselves, and hear personal stories, invite personal stories, because those are truths that can't be denied. If you tell me, Eric, what happened to you yesterday on the subway, I can't deny that truth. There's no other side to that story necessarily. There's your reality as you share it with me. That's very important. And then there needs to be the thoughtful academic work of understanding our history. And that history leads right up to this morning. Our lives now are shaped by historical forces and policy decisions by people in power, and movements for equity by people who are claiming their power. And we need historical facts and personal stories. So into those containers of dialogue, that's what should come. And then I guess I would also say that because those two things are most important, every school community probably has most of the resources it needs to do this work. That's an important thing. We don't need necessarily the special consultant, the off-the-shelf program, the thousands of dollars poured into, I don't know what, there is training needed, and there are experts from whom we can learn a ton. And it's important to seek out that, but it's also important to believe that there are teachers in every school who are very good at discussion. How can we amplify and spread those skills across the community? There are people in the school willing to tell their story. How can we create the safe space for those stories to be told? There are history teachers and others who understand where we came from and how it's impacting our present. How can we amplify those voices? So every school has the resources they need to do this work.
I want to bring in everyone. Thank you again, Elijah. And don't go too far away, because I also want to bring in Jamila and Colin with us right now. I want to ask a question of you three. How, in this kind of moment where we are having and witnessing one of the largest civil rights movements to ever take place in the history of the United States, looking at old Reuters polling, it suggests that Black Lives Matter has more support amongst Americans, including the majority of white Americans. And this is in contrast to the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. Never received the majority of American support during his entire lifetime. So there clearly has been movement in a racial reckoning here. But how can educators work with resistant faculty, administrators, and parents who are just now learning the truth about the impact of our racial past? What might you say to them? What might you say to educators and community leaders who are working with folks who are just now struggling and wrestling with this idea of racial injustice in America? And I'm going to first go to Jamila. Who may be timed out on us. Why don't I move to
I was
you,
muted.
Elijah?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go.
I am sorry.
It's great to see you.
Okay. One of the lessons I learned in reporting this story is to actually look at who is around you, who the allies are, and ask them for support. What I was definitely struck by and surprised was at one point there is a student-led demonstration that happens in the town of Randolph. And who was there were mostly white people. And they were there with a very few Black students who are biracial, who attend the school, and their families. And they gathered 300 or more people. I was impressed by that. That was a community coming together. And I know that the school was not involved in organizing that particular march. that was organized by student alumni and current students. And that was an example of change happening in Randolph. So I say, look around, look who's with you, look who's standing next to you and is willing to go forward, and ask them to join you if you're alone.
Colin, what are your thoughts on this question about how educators can work with resistant faculty and administrators and parents?
One of the first things that comes to my mind is that I think that there is a very important balance to be struck between centering Black voices in this effort and not overburdening Black members of school communities and the community. I think that this is a traumatic time for some people, and Black colleagues in schools especially have been doing anti-racist work for years and often running up against obstacles. So I think when you're talking about resistant members of the community, especially white members of the community, that is an opportunity for white educators, white school leaders, white community leaders to take the lead in fostering that dialogue. I don't think that has to fall on our Black colleagues, first of all. I think that's an opportunity to promote education, and it's an opportunity to promote those uncomfortable conversations, to create a space where it's like, okay, we're going to be vulnerable. We're going to talk about the ways in which we have, manifested racism in our lives. We're going to eliminate that uncomfortable part of the conversation where we're more worried about being called racist than naming racism itself, creating those spaces. I also think it's important that you set some non-negotiables, because I think we can't present everything as a debate, and not everything is neutral, and not everything has two equal sides. And one of those things is that when students or members of our community are being harmed by racism, it's just non-negotiable to debate whether that's happening. And I think we have to move beyond that into more of a dialogue about what it looks like to reconcile that harm, and what it looks like to confront history, what it looks like to confront tradition, and instead center the well-being of everyone around us. And I think if we frame the conversations that way, it's going to be more productive and also less harmful.
Cory, I'm really glad you said that, because some of the students we talked to were tired. They were tired of being the only one doing the work. And I think we have to remember that. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate it.
It's a very good question. And I know we only have a little bit more time with the three of you, and I want to thank you for your time today. I want to see and turn to a moment to see if you have questions for one another, things you might suggest to one another. There's much going on under the umbrella of racial inequality in America. We have pandemic, massive unemployment, climate change that's impacting us. But at the end of the day, our ability to work together is crucial, and racism prevents us. It creates a barrier. And so, Jamila, I want to see if you have any questions you'd like to ask of either Elijah or Colin.
Sure. Elijah, we first came to you because we were so curious about the advisory lesson on hate symbols that you were going to roll out throughout the whole school. And then the pandemic happened, and I know you did a pilot program that we got to observe, but is it going to happen, or how are you going to continue that work and have those conversations in this hybrid situation?
Well, I think the first step is to continue the work among faculty. I may have been even, a bit premature in jumping right into the advisory groups with that lesson, although we chose faculty to pilot it who I think were ready for that. But I think that this is a moment for learning for a lot of us when it comes to radicalization and extremism in our country, and the symbols that are ever evolving in that landscape. So there's work that I would like to do with my colleagues and for myself, and that will prepare us to continue those conversations with kids and with the broader community. I just led a presentation last week where I shared the Western States Center toolkit for confronting white supremacy or white nationalism in schools, the Speak Up at School guide from Teaching Tolerance, and the guide from the SPLC in Peril for caregivers and educators in the COVID era. And as part of that, it was asking teachers to take 4 stances towards their work in this hybrid modality where they're seeing children in person, they're also seeing them in the screen. There's different ways that they're going to encounter symbols and phrases and ideas in this hybrid modality. And those stances are be curious. If you see something that you don't understand, ask the student a question about it, or bring that question to me and we can reflect on it together. Because that symbol may not mean what you think it means. And it's worth knowing what that symbol means to that child or to that person. Be curious, be transparent. So let people know that you are a mandated reporter and that you have to be concerned with harm when it comes to harming others or harming yourself. And be a learner so that you're also learning about the contemporary landscape. And that's why I shared those resources. And the other is be vigilant. When you see, like Cory was saying, there are lines that can't be crossed, and when there's hate speech, it needs to be interrupted and reported. So be vigilant, be curious, be a learner, and be transparent that that's what you're doing.
I have one more question for you, Elijah. Without giving away everything that is going to transpire within the podcast, because we'd like to have listeners also experience that. The question of the mascot, that symbol that your community is grappling with, there was some change, but I know you're not happy with the change. What do you think can happen going forward?
Not sure how I should not reveal what I don't know you reveal in the podcast, but what I think should happen going forward is that we not repeat the mistakes of the past, that we not put back up on our wall an image that feels terrifying or menacing to any people in our community. When it comes to tradition on the one hand and terror on the other, preventing people from feeling terror and fear trumps tradition. So we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past as we reckon with what our mascot is and should be in the future.
That's really helpful. Cory, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'm curious to your thoughts and if you have any questions for Jamila or Elijah.
Yeah, I mean, to Jamila, I think you've obviously had an incredibly storied career. You've interviewed thousands of people. You've worked on hundreds of stories. I'm wondering what you found most stunning, unique, interesting about this culture at Randolph Union and the community that surrounds it.
I was struck by a few things. There was a lot of leaning, a lot of the young people did a lot of the work. And there's one story that I wish we could have gotten more of, but there's a young man who had a petition signed at the school with 250 signatures to bring down the mascot. And he himself is a biracial student, from what I understand, and had experienced quite a bit of harassment and discomfort around the mascot and the treatment that he got from other students. At one point, he just couldn't take it anymore, and he chose to leave the school. To me, that was a very tragic moment for the school, for the educators who were working with him. He never presented this petition to Elijah, and instead the teachers decided to, take up this work. That surprised me because it was a lot of effort of a young person, and then the teachers kind of led the charge around the mascot. I think we have to be careful how much we're trying to lean on young people in those circumstances. the ones who did get tired, who get scared. From talking to the one young man, Amir, and this other student, we have to be sensitive to all their experiences. They don't share everything all the time because they don't want to constantly be complaining. So that surprised me, that it got to that point. And I was also surprised by really how convicted some of the teachers were. Like, they really were willing to lose their jobs to stand up for what was right for these students. And I really admire that, because you don't see that every day. I think that's, in a nutshell, what I was most surprised by.
That actually makes me want to ask a real quick question of Elijah, which is, we're hearing the stakes in Jamila's answer, the stakes for students who take on this work, the stakes for educators who take on this work, and the stakes for school leaders like you who take on this work. So I'm wondering your perspective, if there are some ways community members who might not be members of the school community, but who want to support efforts like this, how can they show their support for schools, for educators, for student activists, so that maybe people feel a little less alone or a little less at risk?
That's a really important question. We felt a lot of that support at Randolph Union, people who would show up for community forums, people who showed up in the newspaper by writing letters to the editor, community members who are willing to come into the school and be a part of book groups that we're reading with students. So that kind of willingness to show up and be present, to be physically present and to be supportive, it means a ton. In part because oftentimes, and I'm sure this is true in many organizations and institutions, you hear more about what's not working well than what's working well, just as a general rule, if you look in my inbox emails. So it means a lot to hear positive encouragement and affirmation in whatever form that takes. It really can go a long way. So folks who are out there and wondering how to support, sometimes it may be as simple as a pat on the back or an email or a letter to the editor, or just being present when there's a meeting and speaking up if you feel the need.
That's very helpful. Again, Cory, Elijah, I want to thank you both for joining us today. It is a pleasure to hear your voices. We are so thankful for the work that you all do. Jamila, I want you to stay with me just for a second as we begin to close out. The question of racial inequality in schools is such a critical point. And I encourage folks to look for resources and to find one another in tools and lessons by visiting teachingtolerance.org. What impacts our students day to day going to school, whether it's virtually or in person, it's important. And it's important that we have spaces for our students where they are focused on learning, not just surviving day to day. I'm proud and admire all the educators out there who work each and every day to make sure that there are environments of learning, not environments of bigotry. And I thank all those parents and community members who are supporting those educators. I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially our speakers. The next episode of the podcast, Sounds Like Hate, the second chapter of the story will be released next week. Question for Jamila, can you tell us a little bit more about the next episode and what to expect?
Yes. So in our next episode, you find out whether or not the school was able to raise the Black Lives Matter flag. You find out what happens to some of the students who have been experiencing racism, and you find out what happens to the mascot. And then COVID-19 happened during production, and because of that and the George Floyd murder, things changed, and we actually decided to go back to Vermont because we found out that a number of students, alumni and current students, felt that it was time to take their battle out of the school, and they wanted their voices heard in the town, and they decided they wanted to march in Randolph. And so you find out about that and what that meant to the community.
thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to tell everyone who's viewing right now, we plan another panel discussion next month following the release of the next chapter of Sounds Like Hate, chapter called Baseless. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the podcast right now and be sure to share it with your family and friends via social media. There is a subscription link that will appear in the chat. We have a clip coming up. I'm going to encourage folks again to know that what you are hearing could be disturbing. It could be triggering, and I will encourage those who may feel that way to turn down the sound. We thank you all for joining us, and we will leave with this sound clip. Thank you so much again to our panelists, to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and to all of those who are joining us in building a 21st century civil rights movement in the United States.
Tune in to the next new episode of the podcast Sounds Like Hate. Randolph Union High School in Vermont is caught in the crosshairs of racism and a battle ripping their community apart.
When you choose a mascot, you really need to do your due diligence around your community and what the mascot is projecting to the rest of the world.
I potentially have a fire here that can devolve into violence. Do I really want to be throwing more rocket fuel on it at this point in time?
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? No! Not one more life! Not one more life!
Listen and subscribe to Sounds Like Hate on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you receive your favorite podcasts.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next month.